Greetings, friends of liberty. As you may see behind me, I'm secluding myself in one of my smaller libraries of my North London residence, taking a short summer vacation, a brief estival interlude, we might say, from my TARDIS excursions of late. Now, at my leisure, as long as Marguerite doesn't drag me to too many balls and parties, I can revisit some of the better works of my age, such as Swift Sculliver's Travels, delightful in its fantasy and scathing in its satire upon humanity. But that brings to mind another book, scathing in its own way, that I recently read from your 21st Century America, the hard-hitting and direct book, The Diversity Delusion by Heather MacDonald, well-known conservative commentator and author of excellent previous works such as The War on Cops, The Burden of Bad Ideas, and Are Cops Racist? She mincing no words here in examining the effects of the ideology of diversity on the academy and more broadly modern society. Her subject, of course, needs no introduction, it being, along with equity and inclusion, one of the three cornerstones of the modern ideology known as DEI. Of course, diversity is the most prominent. Its popularity, in essence, having been guaranteed and its use gracefully facilitated by the Supreme Court decision, Regents of the University of California versus Bakke in 1978. There, Justice Lewis Powell in effect legitimized the use of implicit quotas and institutional racism by college admissions officers as long as the college could plausibly pass off their racism by the rationale of creating a more diverse student body. Miss MacDonald begins, most appropriately and dramatically, by graphically describing as she does her very own treatment as a person with diverse political views visiting the academy at the hands of woke students and administrators. How did those people who claim to love diversity treat Miss MacDonald when she visited their own college? Not well. First, when she arrived, she was transported to an undisclosed location for her own safety. Many obstructive students then, before the lecture, attempted to block the entrance to her auditorium using linked hands. Audio cables for a loudspeaker were stolen, and the crowd prevented supporters attempting to live stream the proceedings. As the lecture commenced, MacDonald spoke from an empty lecture hall, instructed by security to stay out of sight from the windows, the lecture itself being live streamed from the empty room, and she taking a couple of questions remotely before being forced to stop. Now we might step back and ask, what has led American higher education to this dismal point? To universities which can't even ensure that interested students can actually attend a lecture by a speaker they've invited, or to students who feel free and who are allowed to abuse and disrespect speakers with their ad hominem or ignorant statements. MacDonald's answer is the theories of affirmative action, backed by the rationale of diversity. Affirmative action is simply cheating on the part of admissions officers and departments, and has been proven counterproductive time and again in damaging both those unqualified students allowed in and to the qualified individuals not admitted. What evidence do we have for this? That cheating doesn't work? Mountains of evidence, which MacDonald then reviews in her initial chapters. She starts by introducing the concept of mismatch theory. First suggested by Thomas Sowell, perhaps in the 1980s, and explicitly used by him in his 1990 book, Preferential Policies, mismatch theory proposes that if a student is to benefit from college, his academic performance needs to match the academic level of the college and, by implication, the difficulty of the courses he's taking. To illustrate the mismatch effect, let's borrow an example from athletics. If we take a 10-year-old Little League ball player and throw him into the big leagues, will he learn? No, he'll be overwhelmed by the speed and power of the pro game and thus may even be harmed. both psychologically and even physically, in trying to deal with the much larger and stronger players. In exactly the same way, when introducing an unqualified student into a class of high performers, such as are found in elite colleges, that student will often fall behind and then give up, also possibly being damaged like the little leaguer. MacDonald points out that one simple test of mismatch theory was to look at the results in the University of California system before and after Prop 209, which had outlawed racial discrimination in 1996. Before Prop 209, the University of California had admitted students who could barely read, in the words of one of the instructors. But after 209, what happened? When students of color were admitted largely on merit, what happened was what one would expect. A larger percentage of minorities graduated. And minorities who didn't get in Berkeley, went to lower-rated colleges in the system where more graduated as well because they were matched with the college. Matching works. And what was the response of the University of California system to this significant improvement? Avoidance and connivance. They tried to fight the effects and reverse Prop 209 by experimenting with and discovering ever more subtle ways of discriminating. And this they achieved in ways too numerous to recall. At this point, MacDonald introduces Richard Sander, a brilliant mismatch theorist at UCLA who compiled the destructive statistical numbers in general for law schools using affirmative action around the country. He found entirely what one, that is, everyone except those believing in cheating, would expect to find. Law school affirmative action programs massively damaged unqualified black students, resulting in twice as many leaving law schools as whites. Proceeding to other theorists, MacDonald also highlights the work of Peter Arcidiano and others at Duke, who found that blacks given affirmative action don't catch up, but just appear to by switching to easier majors and courses, and also receiving easier grades from woke instructors. Generally speaking, these path-breaking studies naturally received a hostile reception in the academy. Her next focus, that of so-called microaggressions at UCLA, found no lack of cases given the hypersensitivity inculcated into minorities by UCLA. A, the well-liked Professor Rod Rust, upsetting woke minority students by asking them to adhere to the more rigorous Chicago Manual of Style for their grammar and punctuation. B, his spelling of the word indigenous with a lowercase I, insulting the woke again instead of uppercase. C, a woke student charging Rust with battery simply for touching him compassionately on the arm. And D, the aforementioned Richard Sander, set upon verbally when harmless t-shirts he had made for a softball game using ancient legal terms were misinterpreted as racist. What's noteworthy about all these instances is how the degree of students complaining of microaggressions are themselves committing the microaggressions by verbally abusing and haranguing others. Her next subject is that of the alleged phenomenon of implicit bias, which was long accepted as true by everyone from Hillary Clinton, Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy, and FBI Director James Comey. Initially regarded as valid, through quick reaction tests to black and white images or types of words to judge whether someone was racist, implicit bias tests are now recognized as bogus, given their inconsistent results and faulty interpretations, proving yet again another instance of shoddy social science research used by the Academy to induce white guilt. Having dealt with race in the first half of the book, MacDonald now proceeds in the second to deal with gender issues, and as previously knocks down numerous fallacies. First, she notes the irony that those very 60s radicals who advocated freeing the bra and free love are now the very persons attempting to regulate and bureaucratize sex while stifling gender relations through their Title IX tribunals. Secondly, She notes the faulty statistics used by these activists in claiming, for example, that 1/4 or 1/5 of all women will be raped in college, whereas the actual rate is around 0.2%, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, or 1/100th what's claimed. She then describes in great detail how this inflated number was reached by constantly misinterpreting and misclassifying actual collected female responses to surveys, or by additionally misclassifying the reported seriousness of events, contradicting again the women's own responses. The actual reality then is that the degree of violent crime on campuses has decreased by over 40% from 2005 to 2016, and it was never high to begin with. In her third section, Bureaucracy, she describes the growth in the diversity of bureaucracy with, from 1998 to 2009, the faculty growing by 1/4, the students by 1/3, but the administrators, who of course use the woke adherence and rules, by 125%. All those administrators need to be paid, and so it's no surprise then that college is getting so expensive, exactly as it's becoming more woke. In her fourth and final section, she widens her focus to examine other institutions in society, filling the educational gap where colleges have failed us. So, for example, just as Stanford gave up its acclaimed Western Civ program in the 1980s, UCLA dismantled its English equivalent in 2011, jettisoning the study of Chaucer, Milton, and Shakespeare for requirements in gender, colonialist, or critical theory studies. And how has our society responded? By the formation of online course companies like Great Courses and Coursera, which are exceedingly popular since finding great teachers to teach courses on highly interesting subjects is something millions of Americans actually want. And this is also a revealing clue towards showing how private civil society is so much better than those institutions that are influenced by government. That's right. The private sector isn't interested in teaching political correctness since A, it's stupid, and B, it makes them no money. I give this book an A-B+. Given that MacDonald treats so many important topics very proficiently, is forthright and often lively in her prose, and has deep complementary knowledge, such as of policing, the law, and the history of Western civilization, all of which deepen her understanding. And the fact that she has a law degree from Stanford Law shows up in her sharp reasoning and arguments. Are there any mistakes? Minor ones. First, she doesn't mention, as I did when we started, the very Supreme Court decision, Regents of the University of California versus Bakke, which granted diversity as a legal rationale for affirmative action, likely was highly significant in starting this whole delusion. Secondly, she doesn't appear to grasp or explain that the present crisis is not primarily an ideologically driven event, but is instead a result, an effect of Title 7 and 9 of the Civil Rights Act, number one. Number two, the general nonprofit tax exemptions and status of private and public colleges. And number three, the huge governmental funding that universities receive. In other words, it's a delusion or ideology created by bad laws. The ideology coming after higher education had been corrupted and lost its natural intellectual immunity to bad ideas. Thirdly and finally, her advice to young collegiate men to simply wait until after graduation to have sex is not realistic. This advice being on par with a person who, during Prohibition from 1919 to 1932, would have advised giving up alcohol altogether as a way of dealing with the bad moonshine or poisonous liquor that sometimes resulted. On that sex-positive note, I bid you well and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.